It all started when the skies above Earth began to shimmer and the stars flickered unnervingly. For months, astronomers had been tracking strange anomalies in space, faint signals, and unusual patterns they couldn't explain. But nothing prepared them for the day when the massive alien fleet appeared in Earth's orbit. The ships were like nothing humanity had ever seen. Their sleek, jagged designs radiated an unsettling energy, and they moved with a purpose that seemed almost calculated. It wasn't just the sheer size of the fleet that struck terror into the hearts of those who saw it. It was the silence. There was no radio chatter, no warnings, no declaration of intent, just the cold, ominous presence of something far beyond human understanding. At first, it was dismissed as a mirage, a fluke. But as the days passed and the ships grew larger, visible to anyone with access to a telescope, it became clear this was real. Something was out there, something powerful, and it wasn't here for peace. Governments scrambled to respond. Military forces went on high alert, and civilians were urged to prepare for the worst. Every major city on Earth now had its eyes trained on the skies. The world's leaders met in emergency sessions, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all they could do was guess. Who were these beings? What did they want? And most importantly, could they be stopped? The world's best minds came together in a desperate attempt to analyze the alien ships. Data came in from every continent, but there was no consensus. Some thought they were explorers, searching for resources. Others believed they were here for something far more sinister. But the truth was that nobody truly knew. The lack of communication with the visitors was perhaps the most terrifying part. It was as if they weren't concerned with the fact that Earth had a population, that humanity existed at all. Then came the first attack. It wasn't a missile or a bomb, not at first. It was a pulse of energy, unseen but felt by every nation at once. Earth's communication systems blinked out of existence, satellites were disabled in an instant, and even the power grids faltered. It was as if the world itself had been silenced. Panic spread like wildfire, but amidst the chaos, one thing became painfully clear: Earth was helpless. Governments tried to coordinate a countermeasure, but it was futile. The alien ships had a technology that humanity couldn't even begin to comprehend, much less fight back against. Even the most advanced military forces on Earth were helpless in the face of such power. And then, as the world descended into panic, a voice broke through the static. It wasn't the alien ship speaking. It was a human. A young officer from the United Nations Space Command, Commander Kel Reynolds, standing in the ruins of a once thriving military base, took the reins. He broadcasted a message to the entire planet, rallying humanity with words that would go down in history. We may be unprepared, Kel's voice boomed through the emergency channels, but we will not go down without a fight. We've been underestimated before, by nature, by war, and by the very idea of our own limits. Today, we stand together. Humanity has always risen to the challenge, and today will be no different. His message was brief but powerful, a reminder to everyone that, despite the overwhelming odds, humanity wasn't about to back down. The call to arms was sounded, not just in words, but in action. Nations began to mobilize their remaining military forces, and civilians took to the streets, ready to protect their homes and families. Humanity wasn't going to surrender without a fight. As the alien fleet loomed ever closer, Kel knew that this was only the beginning. But one thing was certain: the world had just entered an unimaginable battle, and it was no longer just about survival. It was about proving that humanity, no matter how small or unprepared, was a force to be reckoned with. The calm before the storm was deceptive. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the alien fleet might retreat, or at the very least, wait for Earth's response. But the silence was shattered when the first of the ships descended toward Earth. Its massive form, shimmering with an eerie, unnatural light, broke through the atmosphere, landing with a force that shook the ground for miles. The world held its breath as the ship, an imposing metallic behemoth, stood there, ominously silent. Then came the broadcasts, a series of strange symbols that appeared on every screen, in every language, but the humans could make no sense of them. The alien ships, after all, had no intention of communicating. They were simply setting the stage for what would come next. The attack didn't happen immediately. Instead, the Xalkar, humanity's soon-to-be captors, waited, watching, studying the chaos their arrival had caused. It became clear that they had no interest in obliterating humanity quickly. No, the Xalkar were hunters, and they had set a trap. While Earth's leaders scrambled to organize, the truth was that they had underestimated their enemy. The Xalkar were not here to invade outright. They had a far more insidious plan. They would use the chaos of human panic to draw them towards something much worse, a deadly artifact buried deep beneath the Earth's surface, a relic from ancient times. The artifact was part of their strategy to trap humanity, a device capable of draining the life force of those who came close to it. Commander Cal Reynolds, now leading a coalition of military and scientific minds, gathered his team in a dimly lit command center, trying to piece together a strategy. They couldn't fight what they didn't understand. The only hope they had was to figure out what the aliens wanted, and why they hadn't launched a full-scale assault yet. The answer came in the form of an intercepted transmission. One of the scientists, Dr. Elena Ramirez, discovered a hidden message embedded within the alien signals. It was a map that pointed to an ancient site in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. The coordinates led directly to an underground temple, long thought to be a relic of Earth's earliest civilizations. The moment the discovery was made, Cale realized the implications. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a hunt. The Xalkar had set a snare, and they had drawn humanity into it. Their alien technology was too advanced for Earth's forces to fight directly, but if they could learn to use the artifact, perhaps they could turn the tables. However, the cost was unknown. The artifact might be the key to their salvation, or their destruction. Despite the dangers, Cale knew they had no choice but to investigate. They assembled an elite team of military forces, archaeologists and engineers, led by Cale himself and Dr. Ramirez, to retrieve the artifact before the aliens could use it. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure weighed heavily on Cal's shoulders. The team set off, traveling deep into the jungle, where they would face not only the harsh environment, but also the looming threat of alien surveillance. The Xalkar ships were still visible in the sky, hovering above Earth, their presence a constant reminder of the threat they pose. Every step forward felt like walking into the unknown, yet the team pressed on, driven by the hope that the artifact could provide them with the weapon they needed to fight back. When they finally reached the entrance to the underground temple, Cale felt the weight of the moment. They had no idea what awaited them inside, but one thing was certain. The Xalkar were already aware of their presence, and time was running out. As they entered the temple's dark, winding corridors, the oppressive silence of the place seemed to close in around them. It was clear that they were not alone. The artifacts and murals on the walls hinted at something ancient and powerful, something that had been waiting for eons, hidden from the eyes of the universe until now. In the distance, a soft hum echoed through the halls. The artifact was close, but so too were the dangers that the Xalkar had prepared for them. The hunt had truly begun. The hum grew louder as Cale and his team ventured deeper into the ancient temple. The walls, lined with strange symbols and worn carvings, seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. There was a sense of something alive in the air, as though the very stone they walked upon was watching them, waiting. Every step seemed to echo through the vast, cavernous hallways. Dr. Ramirez, the lead archaeologist, carefully examined the walls. These symbols, they look like a form of communication, but I can't decipher them entirely. It might take days to understand the full meaning of this place. Her voice was tinged with both awe and frustration. "We don't have days," Cale replied, his voice low but resolute. "We don't even have hours." The team was moving quickly, knowing the Xalkar could be watching, and would strike as soon as they realized what the humans were after. They continued down the winding passage until they reached a large circular chamber. In the center, a massive stone pedestal rose, shrouded in an otherworldly glow. It was the artifact, exactly as the Thalkar's signals had suggested, and exactly as they had feared. The artifact hummed with power, and the closer they got, the more the air seemed to vibrate. "What is it?" one of the soldiers whispered, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. He reached out a hand, but Kale quickly stopped him. "Don't touch it," Kale warned, his voice sharp. "We don't know what it does yet. We need to study it first." But just as they began to approach cautiously, a sudden sharp crack reverberated through the chamber, causing the walls to tremble. The lights flickered, and a low growl sounded from the shadows. Kale spun around, his hand instinctively going for his weapon. Out of the darkness emerged a figure, tall, imposing, and clearly not human. The creature's skin was a dull shade of gray, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural amber hue. It was one of the Thalkar. Cal's heart skipped a beat. Damn it, they'd found us. But to his surprise, the creature didn't immediately attack. Instead, it paused, studying them carefully, its glowing eyes flickering with some emotion Cal couldn't quite place. There was something almost hesitant in its gaze. Then, it spoke. "I am not your enemy," the creature said, its voice grating but clear, with a faint hint of sadness. "At least, not anymore." The human stood frozen, unsure how to react. One of the soldiers whispered, "It's one of them. But why would it speak to us?" "I was once a part of the Thalkar," the creature continued, its tone deepening with regret. "But I grew disillusioned with my people's ways. What they plan to do here is not just an invasion. It is a slaughter. They will drain your planet dry, leaving nothing but husks of what once lived. I can't let that happen." Kale stepped forward, still wary but intrigued. "Why are you helping us? What do you want?" The creature's eyes flashed briefly with pain. "I've seen enough death. I've seen worlds fall. I left the Thalkar when I realized their cruelty would never end. My name is Aerith. I am an outcast, but I know their ways better than any of you. I know how to stop them." For a long moment, the teen was silent. They had expected to fight an enemy, not make an uneasy alliance. But Kale knew they couldn't afford to refuse help, especially not when they were up against something they didn't understand. He nodded slowly. "We'll listen to what you have to say. But if you betray us—" "I won't," Aerith interrupted, a flicker of resolve in his eyes. "I've seen the worst of the Thalkar, and I will not allow them to destroy this world. I found a way to disable their technology, but I need your help." Kale hesitated but then turned to Dr. Ramirez and the team. They, too, were wary, but they understood the gravity of the situation. If what Aerith said was true, then humanity's only chance of survival might lie in the hands of their former enemy. "All right," Kale said, his voice firm. "We'll work together, but the moment you try anything—" "I understand," Aerith said. "You don't have to trust me, but you can trust that I want to stop them. And together, we just might have a chance." The alliance, born from necessity and suspicion, had been forged. Kale and his team were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the future of the Earth. But they still had no idea just how deep the Thalkar's plans ran, or how dangerous the artifact could truly be. They had made a dangerous pact with an enemy, and now they had to place their faith in a former foe, hoping that Aerith's knowledge would be enough to save them all. The uneasy alliance between humanity and Aerith began to take shape over the next few days. As they gathered more information, it became clear that the Thalkar's weaponry was more advanced than anything Earth could have ever imagined. The artifact in the temple was just a fragment of a much larger, far more destructive force, one that could wipe out entire planets with a single command. The piece they had discovered was linked to the Thalkar's ability to control energy across the galaxy. "What we're dealing with here," Dr. Ramirez said, her face pale from hours of studying the artifact, is not just an energy source. It's a conduit, a bridge between their power and ours. If they get control of this, it could turn the tide in their favor permanently. Kale rubbed his temples. How do we stop it? Aerith stepped forward, his amber eyes flashing with intensity. We don't stop it, not directly. The artifact, as powerful as it is only part of the system. The real source of their power lies within their fleet, the heart of their operation. If we can access their main ship and disable the central power core, the artifact will lose its energy. Without the core, the artifact becomes nothing more than a heavy stone. It sounded like their best shot, but Kale knew it wouldn't be easy. The Xalkar's flagship, the Drakkar, was an enormous fortress of metal and energy, guarded by an armada. Getting close would be nearly impossible, let alone infiltrating it. We don't have the luxury of time, Kale said, determination hardening his voice. They'll be ready for us, and we'll need a plan. Aerith nodded. The ship is heavily guarded, but I can help you navigate its defenses. I know their technology, their weaknesses. Dr. Ramirez spoke up. You're saying we can infiltrate their flagship. How? Aerith's lips curled into a faint, almost sorrowful smile. I can hack into their systems. I know how to manipulate their energy fields. I'll disable their primary defense grid, but it will only be for a short time. Once we get inside, we need to act fast. Kale exchanged a glance with his team. They were risking everything on a mission that seemed almost suicidal, but without the artifact's destruction, humanity didn't stand a chance. All right, Kale said. We move out in 12 hours. Let's prepare ourselves. The longer we wait, the less chance we have. The next few hours were a blur of frantic preparation. They had to gather their best operatives, weapons, and whatever technology they could use to infiltrate the Xalkar's flagship. There was no room for error. Every moment counted. As the team boarded their stealth ships, Kale couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Aerith, though an ally now, was still an outsider. Could they trust him fully? The plan hinged on his ability to disable the Xalkar's systems. If he betrayed them, it would mean the end of humanity. But the mission had to proceed. There was no turning back now. The journey to the Drakkar was tense. The stealth ships glided through the atmosphere, weaving in and out of the alien fleet's radar range, their movements carefully calculated. Aerith sat at the helm, his eyes closed as he focused on his task, his fingers dancing over the control panel, preparing to break through the defenses of the Drakkar's energy shield. The flagship loomed ahead, its silhouette an intimidating presence in the night sky. The ships that protected it were numerous, and yet they seemed almost passive, as though the Xalkar were waiting for them, confident in their victory. 5 minutes, Aerith said softly, his voice steady despite the enormity of what they were about to do. Once I breach the shield, we'll have a window of 3 minutes to make it inside. Understood, Kale replied. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Time was running out. Ready yourself, Aerith said. This will be the most dangerous part. As the Drakkar's vast exterior grew closer, a calm sense of finality settled over Kale. The next few moments would determine the fate of Earth. It was a mission of survival, but it was also humanity's last chance to show that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, they would not be crushed. They would rise. The countdown began. The moment of truth had arrived. The stealth ships flew in silent formation, cutting through the atmosphere with calculated precision. The Drakkar was within reach now, its massive form filling the horizon. Cal's heart raced. Every fiber of his being was tuned to the mission's success, but there was no escaping the enormity of what they were attempting. If they failed, it would mean the end of Earth as they knew it. Aerith's hands moved quickly, working through the alien interface with practiced ease. Despite his calm exterior, Cal could sense the tension in the air. This was his moment to prove his worth, but it was also the most dangerous part of the mission. The Xalkar had advanced technology, and no one knew exactly what kind of defenses the Drakkar might possess. 3 minutes. Aerith's voice came through the intercom, barely a whisper. Cale clenched his jaw and looked out of the viewports. The sheer size of the Drakkar was staggering. It was like a floating city, and the weapons array visible on its surface was enough to reduce an entire continent to ash with a single blast. The alien fleet surrounding it remained eerily still, as if waiting for something or someone. "Stay sharp," Cale ordered, his voice steady despite the pressure. His team was ready, and now all they had to do was make it through. A beep from the control panel broke the silence. "Shield breach in 10 seconds," Aerith said. His voice was unwavering, but Cale could hear the underlying tension. The countdown was about to begin. They had only a narrow window to get inside the flagship. "Get ready," Cale muttered, gripping the armrest tightly. "Once we're through, we move fast. No hesitations." The ships lurched slightly as Aerith worked his magic on the alien system. The energy shield surrounding the Drakkar shimmered for a moment, then flickered and dropped like a veil being lifted. The breach was made. "Now," Cale barked. The ship shot forward, diving into the heart of the Drakkar, and the world outside went dark as they entered its shadow. The calm silence of the void was replaced by the hum of alien machinery and the low thrumming of the ship's power systems. Inside, the atmosphere was cold, the walls made of sleek, dark material that seemed to absorb the light. Cale's team moved quickly, checking their weapons, making sure the silencers were in place. The last thing they needed was to alert the entire ship to their presence. Aerith led the way, his eyes scanning the surroundings, as though he could sense where the Xalkar were even without seeing them. He motioned for the team to follow, his pace measured but quick. The corridors of the Drakkar were labyrinthine, but Aerith knew them well, and with each step, he led them closer to their goal. "We need to reach the core," Aerith said softly, his voice barely audible. "Once we get there, I can disable the power grid, but it will trigger alarms. We'll have less than 5 minutes before the ship's systems go into lockdown." The tension in the air was palpable. 5 minutes wasn't nearly enough time. They had to act swiftly. They moved through the ship's corridors with urgency, avoiding patrols and bypassing security systems with Aerith's guidance. Cale's team was trained for this kind of mission, but this was unlike any operation they'd ever faced. Every corner, every shadow, could hide a threat. As they reached a large metallic door, Aerith held up a hand. "The core is behind this," he whispered. "I'll need a moment to bypass the final security measures." Cale nodded. "We don't have time for mistakes. Get it done." Aerith stepped forward, his fingers dancing over the console embedded in the door. Cale watched the countdown clock ticking down in his mind. Every second felt like an eternity. The ship was alive with the sound of distant machinery and the soft whirring of alien technology, and Cale knew it was only a matter of time before the Xalkar discovered them. Suddenly, a series of sharp, metallic footsteps echoed from the hallway behind them. Aerith's hands flew over the console, his movements frantic now. "Hurry," he hissed. The security measures were tougher than he had expected, and the sound of the approaching footsteps grew louder. "Just a few more seconds," Aerith shouted. The door began to hum and shift, and Cale's team tensed, preparing for a fight. Finally, with a mechanical hiss, the door opened, revealing a vast chamber filled with glowing alien machinery. In the center stood the power core, a pulsating orb of energy, surrounded by intricate tech that hummed with an almost hypnotic force. "We have to destroy it," Aerith said, stepping into the chamber. "Once it's down, the Xalkar will be cut off from their power." The team filed in quickly, moving into position as Cale surveyed the room. He knew they didn't have much time. With a deep breath, he turned to Aerith. "Do it," Cale ordered. And in that moment, everything hinged on the next few seconds. The fate of Earth and the future of humanity rested on what they did next. The chamber was silent except for the soft hum of the alien core. Its glow pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm, filling the room with a cold, eerie light. Kale stood at the threshold, his eyes locked on the core, knowing that their survival depended on disabling this alien machine. "Remember," Aerith whispered, his voice low and intense, "if we destroy it incorrectly, it could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. We need to be precise. No mistakes." Kale nodded, his focus absolute. "You know how to do this. We trust you." Aerith didn't respond immediately. His amber eyes were fixed on the intricate network of cables and glowing panels surrounding the core. His hands moved quickly, his fingers tapping and sliding across the alien controls with confidence. Despite his calm demeanor, Cal could see the effort it took for him to manipulate their technology. He wasn't just hacking into an enemy system. He was using a system that had been designed for beings far more advanced than humanity. Dr. Ramirez, standing at Cal's side, peered over Aerith's shoulder, watching as he interfaced with the power grid. "This is beyond anything we've ever seen," she muttered. "If he pulls this off, we might actually have a shot." "But can we really trust him?" Cal asked quietly, glancing at Aerith. The alien's motives were still a mystery, despite his apparent willingness to help. "Focus, Cal," Dr. Ramirez said. "There's no time for doubts now." As Aerith continued to work, Cal's mind raced. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, every second ticking away. He glanced at the team, who were positioned strategically around the chamber, weapons ready. They were all in this together. If Aerith succeeded, they could shut down the entire fleet. If he failed, it was game over. Aerith's voice broke through Cal's thoughts. "It's done," he said, his tone more confident than it had been since they entered the Drakkar. The alien panel shifted, and the pulsing glow of the core seemed to flicker and fade. For a brief moment, it looked like they had won, but just as Cal allowed himself to feel the slightest spark of hope, the lights in the chamber flickered violently. A low rumble reverberated through the walls. No, Aerith cursed. "It's not shutting down. The Salkar are rerouting the energy." A sudden shrill alarm sounded, echoing through the corridors, and the floor beneath them trembled. Cal's heart raced as the familiar sound of enemy footsteps filled the air. Their time was up. "We have to move," Cal shouted. Now. Without hesitation, the team sprang into action. They had no choice but to retreat. The energy from the core had been redirected, and now the ship's systems were waking up, reactivating with lethal force. The Drakkar was no longer passive. It was ready for battle. The walls around them shifted, revealing alien soldiers in sleek combat armor, weapons drawn, and eyes glowing with hatred. "Cover the exit," Cal ordered as he and Aerith led the charge toward the door they had entered. The team moved with practiced precision, returning fire as the alien soldiers rushed toward them. Cal's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his focus, firing his weapon with deadly accuracy. The alien soldiers fell back under the pressure, but more seemed to materialize out of the walls. Aerith moved with fluid grace, his hands quickly dispatching any Xalkar that came too close. He was a soldier, too, despite his past. It was becoming clear that the alien was more than just an informant. He was a weapon in his own right. "Up ahead," Aerith shouted, pointing toward a narrow corridor. "The escape route is close." Cal signaled the team to follow, but just as they started moving, a massive blast hit the walls behind them. The force threw them forward, and Cal barely managed to catch himself against a wall. His ears rang, and the sound of metal tearing filled the air. "Keep moving," Cal roared, pulling himself up. The corridor ahead was dimly lit, and the sound of distant explosions grew louder. The Drakkar was coming alive, and if they didn't escape now, the ship would become their tomb. Aerith led the way, his alien knowledge guiding them through the twisting maze of the ship. But every turn they took, every step forward, felt like they were getting deeper into the heart of the beast. Cal's mind raced as they sprinted through the halls, They had triggered something inside the Drakkar, something far more dangerous than they realized. The artifact had been their only hope. But now, it seemed like the entire ship was waking up, and every living thing aboard would be hunting them. The only question that remained was whether they could escape with their lives, or if the Xalkar would make sure humanity never had a chance to rise again. The team pushed forward through the winding corridors, their footsteps echoing like a countdown to their inevitable fate. The alarms blared louder with every passing second, signaling that the Drakkar was in full alert. The lights flickered sporadically, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls as they ran. Kel's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to slow down. There was no room for hesitation, not when the ship's destruction was imminent, and they had no idea how much time they had before the Xalkar locked the ship down entirely. Aerith led the charge, his movements fluid and precise as he navigated the ship's complex layout. His knowledge of the Drakkar's inner workings was their only advantage now, and Kel trusted him, even though the circumstances were far from ideal. The tension in the air was thick. If they didn't reach the escape pod soon, they'd be trapped. "We're almost there," Aerith called over his shoulder, his voice strained but determined. "Keep moving." The sound of alien soldiers closing in on them was unmistakable. They were relentless, firing on sight. A burst of gunfire whizzed past Kel's head as they turned another corner, narrowly dodging the blast. He didn't even flinch. His training had kicked in, and now his focus was singular: survival. Behind them, the Drakkar groaned as its power core fluctuated, the entire ship reacting to the disruption they caused. The more they moved, the more unstable things became. Kel's gut twisted with the realization that the Drakkar wasn't just waking up, it was fighting back. "Aerith, how much longer?" Kel shouted, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing chaos. "2 more hallways," Aerith replied, his voice barely audible above the clamor. "But there's a heavy patrol ahead. We'll have to fight our way through." Kel nodded, already scanning their surroundings for any potential cover. "We can't afford to wait." Just as Aerith had predicted, they turned the corner and found themselves facing a heavily armed squad of Xalkar soldiers. The aliens' glowing eyes gleamed in the darkness, their weapons aimed and ready. Without hesitation, Kel's team opened fire, their shots precise and calculated. The Xalkar were fast, but humanity had one thing they didn't: adaptability. Kel moved with quick precision, darting from cover to cover, his rifle in hand. He could feel the heat of enemy fire singing the walls around him, but he stayed focused. Each soldier that fell brought them one step closer to their goal. But they couldn't afford to linger. The longer they fought, the more they risked being overwhelmed. "Push forward," Kel shouted, his voice sharp. He caught a glimpse of Aerith, who was at the front, taking down enemies with the same deadly grace that had earned him Kel's trust. The alien was relentless, and Kel could see now that Aerith had more than earned his place among them. They were nearly there, just a few more meters to the escape pods. The sound of their pursuers grew louder, but Kel didn't allow himself to look back. His focus was forward. The escape pods were their only way out of this nightmare, and they were so close. Almost there. Aerith's voice cut through the chaos, filled with urgency. Suddenly, a sharp explosion ripped through the hallway. Kel was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing as smoke and debris filled the air. He struggled to regain his bearings, his heart racing as he tried to push through the disorientation. "Kel," Dr. Ramirez's voice pierced through the smoke. "Get up. We're not out yet." Kel scrambled to his feet, shaking off the daze. He could see the escape pod bay in the distance, just beyond the smoke and debris. His team was already regrouping, moving toward the last stretch of the corridor. But the explosion had drawn more attention. The Xalkar soldiers, more determined than ever, emerged from the smoke, weapons raised. There was no time to waste now. This was the final stand. Kel could feel his pulse in his throat, the pressure mounting. He didn't have time to second-guess himself. He had to protect his team, no matter the cost. "We're not leaving anyone behind," Cale yelled, rallying his team. "Move." With renewed determination, Cale and his team surged forward, taking down their enemies as they fought their way toward the escape pods. But just as they were about to reach the final stretch, another explosion shook the ship, knocking them off balance. A massive piece of debris fell, blocking their path to the pods. "Move, move, move," Cale barked, adrenaline flooding his system. There was no turning back now. They either got out, or they died trying. Aerith was the first to reach the debris. With a roar of effort, he lifted the heavy piece of wreckage, allowing the team to slip through one by one. Cale could see the escape pods just ahead, their salvation. But the Xalkar were closing in fast. Cale could hear their footsteps, the thud of their armor echoing in the hallway. There was no time left. The team had to move faster. "Go. Now," Cale shouted as he turned to cover their retreat, the weight of their mission pressing down on him like a storm. They were so close, just a few more steps, and they would escape. But Cale knew that even with victory within their grasp, the real battle was just beginning. The Drakkar was dying, and with it the Xalkar's wrath. And the war was far from over. Cale's heart pounded in his chest as he took the final steps toward the escape pods. The sound of alien soldiers closing in behind them was deafening, each step heavier than the last. He could hear their growls and mechanical clicks as they sprinted through the hallway. But Cale didn't turn around. There was no time to waste, no room for hesitation. His team was almost there. They just had to reach the pods. "Almost there," Aerith shouted. The last piece of debris shifted aside. "Go." The team rushed forward, weapons still raised, scanning the shadows for any remaining threats. The escape pods were only a few meters away, but the hallways were narrow, and the Xalkar were relentless. The ship trembled once more, and Cale could feel the floor beneath him vibrating as the Drakkar groaned, its systems in total chaos. Dr. Ramirez was the first to reach the hatch of one of the pods. She slammed her hand against the control panel, activating the opening sequence. The heavy door of the pod hissed open with a metallic groan. "In," she shouted, urgency in her voice. Cale didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward the pod, adrenaline surging. Aerith was already at the door, pushing the others in. But just as Cale reached the hatch, a hail of fire erupted from behind. The first alien soldier appeared, weapons raised. Without thinking, Cale dove into the pod, taking cover and returning fire. "Go, go, go," Cale shouted. The doors to the escape pod slammed shut just as another blast shook the ship. The pod shuddered violently, but its engines roared to life. They were launching. Cale watched through the viewport as the interior of the Drakkar flickered with explosions. It was a momentary view of destruction. The massive ship collapsing in on itself, the heart of the Xalkar fleet dying with every passing second. "We made it," Dr. Ramirez said, her voice filled with disbelief. But Cale knew that the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As they tore through the atmosphere, the Drakkar behind them continued to burn, but the Xalkar fleet remained intact. The war would go on. Aerith stood at the front of the pod, his face expressionless as he studied the starry expanse outside the viewport. His eyes flickered with something Cale couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or relief. Whatever it was, it didn't change the fact that they had lost too much. The mission had been a success, but the cost was steep. Cale leaned back in his seat, his mind replaying the events over and over. They had struck a blow against the Xalkar, but Cale knew that without the artifact, they hadn't crippled the enemy. The Xalkar would rebuild, and humanity would have to face them again, harder and more determined than ever. Dr. Ramirez let out a long breath. "We've done it. We've given Earth a chance." "For now," Cale muttered. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The escape pod shook again, this time from the turbulence of re-entry. Cale glanced at Aerith. What now? Aerith didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the stars. The Drakkar was just one ship. The Salkar have a fleet scattered throughout the galaxy. Earth is safe. For now. But we need to be ready. Cale nodded. The harsh reality of their situation was settling in. This victory had given them breathing room, but they couldn't afford to think it was over. The Salkar were not just another enemy. They were a force to be reckoned with. Do you have a plan? Cale asked. Aerith's lips curled into a faint smile. I always have a plan. Cale couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. Aerith might have been an enigma, but at least he was on their side. For now, that was enough. As the escape pod sailed through space, heading toward Earth's orbit, Cale looked out the viewport once more. The war was far from over, but humanity had taken its first step toward survival. And that, he knew, was a victory in itself. The road ahead would be long, and the cost would be great. But for the first time in a long while, Cale allowed himself to believe that humanity might just have a chance.